June Okafor had timed her mornings around Preston Cole for the better part of a year, the way you learn to time a commute around road construction. Not because you expect it to change but because the alternative costs you more each time you get caught in it. She'd figured out his patterns early. He favored the 7:50 elevator run, arrived at the building fashionably late for a man of his seniority, and rode up with whichever colleagues happened to be gathered in the lobby at the same moment, an audience he seemed to consider part of the commute's actual purpose. She worked 2 floors below him in the account management wing where she'd spent 4 years building a reputation with clients that should have, by any reasonable measure, translated into advancement. She was methodical in a way the firm's leadership claimed to value in performance reviews and then quietly overlooked when promotion lists were drawn up. Clients requested her by name, renewal rates on her accounts outpaced the office average, and none of it had ever once been enough to get her considered for the kind of role Preston occupied without apparent effort. Preston had made a habit over the better part of that year of commenting on her body in the specific casual way that let him claim afterward he'd only been joking. Remarks about portion sizes when they crossed paths near the break room, a comment about elevators and weight limits delivered with a grin to colleagues who either laughed along or found something urgent to study on their phones rather than object. Nobody had ever told him to stop. June had stopped expecting anyone would. This particular Tuesday she'd miscalculated her timing, arriving in the lobby at 7:50 exactly, and found herself stepping into a crowded elevator car at the same moment Preston did. 3 other colleagues already inside, the doors beginning their slow slide toward closed. "There she is," Preston said, loud enough to fill the small space entirely, his voice carrying the specific brightness of a performer who'd found his morning audience. "I was starting to think you'd taken the stairs. Didn't want to risk this thing groaning under the extra." The laughter that followed wasn't universal. One colleague stared fixedly at her phone. Another offered the thin, uncomfortable smile of someone who disapproved but lacked whatever it took to say so. But it was enough, the particular, familiar sound of a room deciding collectively that going along cost less than pushing back. June stared at the floor numbers ticking upward, absorbing it the way she always had, her jaw tight, her spine straight, refusing to give Preston the visible reaction that would only extend the performance further. "I'm sure the elevator's fine, Preston," she said, her voice flat, offering the minimum acknowledgement required to avoid seeming rattled. "Just looking out for everyone's safety," Preston said, and the grin in his voice made clear he'd heard her flatness and decided to escalate against it rather than yield to it. "Maybe the corporate should put up a sign. Weight limits aren't just for elevators, you know." The doors, which had opened at the next floor to let one colleague off, began sliding closed again, and June had already resigned herself to 2 more floors of exactly this when a hand shot out from the hallway and stopped them. Emilio Vasca stepped half into the frame, not entering the car, not riding down, simply holding the doors open with an immovable stillness that filled the small space with a different kind of silence than the one Preston had been performing moments earlier. He didn't look at Preston directly. He looked at June first, a brief, assessing glance that carried no pity, only attention, and then slowly let his gaze settle on Preston and stayed there. Preston's grin faltered, the specific uncertainty of a performer suddenly aware his audience had shifted without his permission. "Can I help you?" Emilio said nothing. He simply held the door, his expression unreadable, waiting with the particular patience of a man who had nowhere else he needed to be and no interest in filling silence for anyone's comfort but his own. The remaining colleagues in the elevator car went very still, the earlier complicated laughter evaporating entirely into something closer to collective discomfort. Preston opened his mouth once as if to reclaim the moment with another joke, and found apparently that he had nothing left to say to a room that had stopped laughing the instant a stranger decided their silence had gone on long enough. The elevator finally continued its ascent once Emilio stepped back and let the doors close, though he didn't ride with them. June watched through the narrowing gap as he remained in the hallway, his attention still fixed briefly on the space where Preston stood before the doors sealed shut entirely. The remaining ride passed in a silence considerably different from the one June usually endured. Not the practiced blankness she'd perfected over a year of exactly this treatment, but something charged and unresolved, Preston's earlier bravado visibly deflated, the other colleagues studying their phones with a new, genuine intensity that suggested they were replaying what they'd just witnessed rather than simply waiting it out. June got off at her floor without another word from anyone, her pulse still elevated, uncertain whether what had just happened represented rescue or merely a different, stranger kind of exposure. She didn't know the man's name. She didn't fully understand why a stranger had bothered. She found out 3 days later, when the same man appeared near her floor's reception area during a slow Thursday afternoon, his presence causing a visible ripple of attention among the junior staff who clearly recognized him even if June didn't. "June Okafor," he said, not quite a question, though he waited for her confirmation anyway. "That's me," she said carefully, recognizing him immediately from the elevator despite the different lighting, the same stillness in his bearing that had filled that small space 3 days earlier. "You're the one who held the door." "Emilio Vasca," he said, offering the name plainly, without any of the practiced charm men in positions of visible authority usually deployed when they wanted something. "I own the building through a holding company most tenants never think to ask about directly. I was in the lobby that morning for an unrelated meeting and happened to catch the elevator at the wrong moment or the right one depending on how you look at it." June felt a complicated mixture of things at that. Relief that the intervention hadn't been some strange coincidence she couldn't account for, and a fresh wave of embarrassment at having her humiliation witnessed by someone with, apparently, considerable influence over the building itself. "I appreciate what you did," she said. "You didn't have to." "Does that happen often?" Emilio asked, his voice carrying none of the performative concern she might have expected, only direct, careful curiosity. "What I saw in that elevator. Is that a pattern, or was that an unusual morning?" The question landed differently than she'd expected. Not talked over, not managed, simply asked and waiting genuinely for her answer rather than assuming it. June considered deflecting, the old, practiced instinct to minimize rising automatically. Instead, something in his directness pulled a more honest answer out of her than she'd offered anyone at the firm in over a year. "It happens regularly," she said. "Comments about my body, mostly in front of other people, are timed so it always looks like a joke rather than what it actually is. I've stopped expecting anyone to say anything about it. Most people either laugh or look away." "I didn't laugh," Emilio said. "And I don't intend to look away, now that I've seen it directly rather than simply hearing about it secondhand." "What does that mean practically?" "I'm not certain yet," Emilio admitted with a candor that surprised her. "I own the space this firm leases. That gives me more leverage than most tenants realize, though I don't intend to use it carelessly. I'd like to request a meeting with building management this week. General language about tenant conduct standards, nothing that names you directly, simply enough to signal that I'm now watching this particular firm considerably more closely than I was a week ago." June felt something unfamiliar move through her at that. Not quite hope, which she'd learned not to trust after a year of watching nothing change no matter how uncomfortable Preston's behavior became, but something adjacent to it, the specific, cautious possibility of being taken seriously by someone with actual power to act on it. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know what else to say to that." "You don't need to say anything else," Emilio said. "I'm not asking for gratitude. I'm telling you what I intend to do, because I think you deserve to know rather than simply notice changes happening around you without explanation." He left without further ceremony, and June stood in the reception area for a long moment afterward, turning the exchange over in her mind, uncertain whether she'd just witnessed the beginning of something that might actually change her circumstances, or simply one more well-intentioned gesture that would fade once the initial discomfort of the elevator incident passed. The elevator incident spread through the office as gossip within days, the story reaching June secondhand through colleagues who suddenly seemed considerably more willing to make eye contact with her than they had the previous week. A specific, uncomfortable kind of attention that felt less like solidarity and more like curiosity about how the story might continue to unfold. Preston's response arrived not as apology but as retaliation, delivered with the particular, deniable subtlety of someone who understood exactly how to make consequences look like unrelated business decisions. It began with her accounts. June discovered, checking the client management system on a Monday morning, that 3 of her longest-standing accounts had been quietly reassigned to junior colleagues over the weekend, the change logged without any conversation, without any explanation beyond a generic note about workload rebalancing that named no one specifically responsible. She found her supervisor, a mild, conflict-averse man named Desmond Kirby, in his office later that morning, the reassignment printout in her hand. "I need to understand why my accounts were moved without any discussion," she said. "These are clients I've managed for years. Renewal conversations are coming up on 2 of them. Preston mentioned some concerns about capacity. Desmond said, not quite meeting her eyes. The specific discomfort of a man relaying an explanation he didn't entirely believe in himself. Said it might be time to redistribute some of the workload more evenly across the team. Preston doesn't manage my accounts, June said. He has no standing to reassign my clients. He raised it with senior leadership, Desmond said. It's already been approved. I'm sorry, June. I didn't have much say in it. The reassignment was only the beginning. Over the following 2 weeks, June found herself quietly excluded from meetings she'd previously always attended, calendar invitations simply stopping without explanation, project updates circulating through email chains that somehow never included her despite her name remaining, technically on the relevant client list. Each individual incident carried enough plausible deniability that raising a formal complaint about any single one felt, to June, like it would read as oversensitivity rather than a genuine pattern. She started documenting it anyway. Dates, times, the specific language used to justify each exclusion. Not because she had a clear plan for the documentation, but because the habit of careful record-keeping felt like the only thing keeping her grounded as her professional footing eroded week by week. She mentioned the pattern to Emilio during one of the brief, occasional check-ins he'd taken to arranging, ostensibly about building matters, though both of them understood by now the conversations had become about considerably more than tenant conduct standards. He's retaliating, she said, sliding her notes across the small table in the building's ground-floor cafe where they'd taken to meeting. Nothing I can point to individually as clear-cut retaliation. Just accounts moving, meetings disappearing, projects updating without me. If I complain formally, I don't have proof of intent. I just have a pattern that could be explained away as coincidence. Emilio studied the notes with the same careful attention he'd shown the elevator confrontation weeks earlier, his expression sharpening into something focused and quietly furious. This isn't a coincidence, he said. This is someone smart enough to retaliate without leaving obvious fingerprints. That takes practice. You think he's done this before? I think a man this comfortable with plausible deniability learned the skill somewhere, Emilio said. I have resources through the building's management company that could help clarify whether this is truly the first time your firm has dealt with something like this. I'd like to use them if you're willing. June hesitated, the old instinct to minimize rising again despite weeks of Emilio's steady, careful attention gradually eroding it. What happens if you find something? Then we'll know considerably more than we do right now, Emilio said. I'm not interested in acting on assumptions. I'd rather have facts before I decide what leverage actually exists here. She nodded, the decision settling into something she recognized even in the moment as significant, not because she fully understood yet what it would uncover, but because it represented the first time in weeks that she'd felt like an active participant in her own situation rather than simply someone absorbing consequences she hadn't caused. Emilio's team completed their review within 10 days, and he arrived at their now regular cafe meeting with a folder considerably thicker than any he'd brought before, his expression carrying a controlled gravity that told June, before he said a word, that whatever he'd found had confirmed something worse than either of them had initially suspected. 3 prior complaints, he said, sliding the folder across the table. Filed against Preston over the past 6 years, each by a different woman who worked under his supervision or in close proximity to his accounts. Each one settled quietly with departing employees and non-disclosure agreements attached to their severance. June opened the folder slowly, scanning through summaries that had been carefully redacted to protect the identities of the women involved, though the pattern itself required no names to become devastatingly clear. Complaints about comments on appearance, about exclusion from meetings following those complaints, about accounts quietly reassigned in the weeks that followed each formal report. This has happened before, she said quietly, the realization landing with a weight that reframed her entire year at the firm. 3 times. And each time the firm made it disappear instead of addressing it. Because Preston's client relationships are lucrative, Emilio said, something cold entering his voice. The firm chose to protect revenue over protecting the women working under him. 3 separate times. Your elevator incident is the first one witnessed directly by someone outside the firm's internal reporting structure, someone with no financial stake in making it disappear quietly. June felt the specific disorienting vertigo of watching her own private ordeal reveal itself as one piece of something considerably larger and more calculated than she'd allowed herself to imagine. "I thought I was the only one," she said. "I've spent a year telling myself I was simply unlucky, that I'd drawn the short straw of working near someone who happened to be cruel." "You weren't unlucky," Emilio said. "You were targeted by someone who'd learned 3 times over exactly how to get away with it. The firm's leadership isn't ignorant of this pattern, June. They've actively protected it for years." The revelation reframed everything Emilio had been building toward since their first conversation weeks earlier. No longer simply a matter of one uncomfortable elevator incident and its retaliatory aftermath, but a documented, repeated failure of institutional accountability that had cost at least 3 other women their positions and their silence in exchange for severance. "What do we do with this?" June asked, though some part of her had already begun anticipating the shape of the answer. "I want to give you the choice," Emilio said carefully. "I could take this directly to firm leadership myself, using my position as the building's owner to force accountability regardless of what you decide. But I don't want to make that choice for you without asking first. Once this moves forward formally, there's no version where it stays contained to a quiet correction. It exposes years of institutional failure publicly, in a way that could affect people beyond just Preston. Including me," June said. "My reputation if this becomes public in the wrong way." "Including you," Emilio agreed. "Though I'd argue your reputation is already at risk, given how visibly your accounts have been reassigned and your position marginalized over the past few weeks. Staying quiet hasn't protected you so far. I don't think it will start protecting you now." June sat with the documentation in front of her, the weight of 3 other women's silenced experiences alongside her own accumulating into something she could no longer simply absorb the way she'd absorbed a year of comments and jokes and quiet exclusions. "I want this addressed properly," she said finally, the decision carrying a firmness that surprised even her. "Not just for me. For whoever comes after me if nothing changes. I'm done being told to manage my own reactions to something that was never my responsibility to manage in the first place." "Then we move forward," Emilio said. "But I need you to understand, once this starts, Preston will not go quietly. A man who practiced plausible deniability doesn't simply accept exposure without a fight." Preston's response arrived faster than either of them anticipated, delivered not through further quiet retaliation but through direct, unmistakable threat once he sensed correctly that the ground beneath his careful pattern of deniability had begun to shift. He cornered June near the elevator bank itself, the same location where Emilio had first intervened weeks earlier, timing the encounter for a moment when the hallway was otherwise empty, his composure carrying none of the performative charm he'd deployed for his usual audience. "I hear you've been talking to the building owner," Preston said, his voice low and carrying a coldness June hadn't heard from him before, the joking register entirely abandoned. "I'd think carefully about what you imagine that gets you, June. I've been in this industry for 15 years. I know people at every firm you'd ever want to work for. If you pursue this any further, I promise you your career in this industry ends. Nobody hires the woman who couldn't handle a few jokes and decided to burn down her own firm instead." The threat landed with a specific calculated precision, aimed exactly at the fear June had carried since Emilio first raised the possibility of formal action. The fear that speaking up wouldn't simply cost her this position, but every position she might ever hope to hold in an industry small enough that reputations traveled fast and thoroughly. "I didn't decide to burn anything down," June said, her voice carrying a steadiness that surprised her even as fear tightened in her chest. "You decided that the moment you started reassigning my accounts because a stranger held an elevator door. I'm simply the person documenting what you've already done. Documentation doesn't matter if nobody in this industry will ever take a meeting with you again," Preston said. "Think about that carefully before you do something you can't undo." He left her standing near the elevators, the threat hanging in the air with a weight that followed her back to her desk, her hands unsteady as she tried to return to work that suddenly felt considerably less important than the fear now settling into her chest. She found Emilio that evening, delivering Preston's threat with a flatness that barely concealed the genuine fear underneath it. "He threatened my entire career. Said he'd make sure nobody in the industry hires me if I pursue this further. He's not wrong that he has the connections to make that happen, at least partially." Emirio's expression hardened into something June hadn't yet witnessed from him across their weeks together. The careful, measured calm he'd maintained throughout their growing partnership giving way to focused, controlled fury. "That's not a veiled threat," he said. "That's an explicit one, made in response to a legitimate complaint process. That's not protecting himself anymore. That's compounding his exposure." "It doesn't feel like compounding anything," June said. "It feels like exactly the kind of threat that's worked on 3 other women before me. It worked because those 3 women didn't have someone with genuine leverage standing beside them," Emirio said. "I own the building his firm leases. His threats about industry connections mean considerably less against someone who controls the physical space his entire operation depends on." He studied her carefully, something gentler entering his voice beneath the controlled anger. "But I need you to decide honestly whether you're prepared for what comes next, knowing he's willing to threaten your career directly rather than simply retaliating quietly. This is a different level of risk than what we discussed before." June thought about a year of absorbed comments, about 3 other women whose silence had been purchased with severance and NDAs, about the specific, exhausting exercise of managing her own reactions to cruelty that had never once been her responsibility to manage. "I'm prepared," she said. "I've spent a year being afraid of exactly this kind of threat and it's cost me my accounts and my standing anyway even while I stayed quiet. I don't think staying quiet protects me the way I once believed it did." "Then we move forward formally," Emirio said. "Tomorrow. I want to meet with firm leadership directly with the incident report, the pattern of prior complaints and your own documentation, laid out plainly enough that there's no remaining room for them to make this disappear the way they made the previous 3 disappear." The greatest setback of the entire ordeal arrived that same night, delivered through an email from Human Resources informing June that her position was being placed under formal performance review, citing vague concerns about team dynamics and professional conduct, that named no specific incidents but carried unmistakably Preston's fingerprints throughout every carefully deniable phrase. June received the performance review notice at her kitchen table, the specific cold finality of it landing with a weight that made even Emirio's considerable leverage feel, for one disorienting moment, insufficient against a firm that had already decided institutionally to protect its most lucrative broker over the woman documenting his pattern of harassment. She called Emirio immediately, her voice carrying a rawness she'd rarely allowed herself throughout their weeks of careful, measured partnership. "They've placed me under formal performance review." Vague language, no specific incidents named, but it's obviously retaliation for the complaint we're preparing. Preston made sure the firm moved before we could formalize anything ourselves. Emirio's response carried none of the panic the situation might have justified, only a focused, immediate resolve. "That doesn't change what happens tomorrow," he said. "If anything, it strengthens our case considerably. A performance review initiated the same week you began documenting a harassment pattern, with vague, unspecific language designed to avoid naming the actual conduct at issue. That's not a coincidence any reasonable observer would accept. That's retaliation, time-stamped and documented." "It still feels like they're trying to end this before it starts," June said. "Before your meeting even happens." "I'm not waiting on their internal process any longer than we already have," Emirio said. "Tomorrow's meeting happens as planned with everything we've gathered, the 3 prior complaints, your documentation, and now this performance review as additional evidence of retaliation. I want you in that room when I present it. Not because you need me speaking for you. Because you deserve to watch this firm finally reckon with what they've protected for years, rather than hearing about the outcome secondhand. Are you certain that's wise, given Preston's threat about my career?" "I'm certain it's necessary," Emirio said. "Whatever risk exists in speaking plainly tomorrow, the risk of staying silent has already cost you your accounts, your standing, and now your formal position at this firm. Silence hasn't protected you, June. I don't think it's going to start now." June sat with that for a long moment, the fear Preston had planted in her chest weighing against the specific, hard-won clarity of everything she'd learned over the preceding weeks. That her silence had never actually been the thing keeping her safe, only the thing that had let the pattern continue unchecked for 3 women before her. "I'll be there," she said finally. "I've been documenting this for weeks, hoping it might matter eventually. I'd like to be in the room when it finally does." "Then tomorrow we finish this properly," Emirio said. "I want you to bring every piece of documentation you've gathered. dates, times, exact language used in each exclusion. I have the prior complaints and the incident report. Between the two of us, there won't be room left for leadership to claim this is simply your word against Preston's version of events. June spent that evening organizing weeks of careful notes into a coherent timeline, the specific methodical work settling her nerves in a way little else had managed since Preston's threat near the elevators. By the time she finished, she understood, with a clarity that had taken weeks to fully develop, that she wasn't walking into tomorrow's meeting as a victim hoping to be believed. She was walking in as someone who'd built an airtight case, one careful entry at a time, exactly the kind of documentation that made her genuinely valuable to a firm that had never once bothered to recognize it before. The meeting convened the following morning in the firm's largest conference room. Senior leadership assembled alongside Desmond Kirby and, seated with a composure that was already visibly fraying, Preston himself, his earlier threats replaced by the careful defensive posture of a man sensing correctly that the walls around his years of protected misconduct had finally begun to close. "I'd like to address the pattern of complaints against Preston Cole," Emilio said, standing at the head of the table with the same flat, unhurried authority he'd carried since first holding that elevator door weeks earlier. 3 prior incidents, each settled quietly with departing employees and non-disclosure agreements, spanning the past 6 years. I have documentation of each. I'd also like to address Ms. Okafor's recent experience, including the elevator incident I witnessed directly, the retaliatory reassignment of her accounts, and the performance review initiated this week under circumstances that any reasonable observer would recognize as retaliatory. The firm's managing partner, a careful woman named Ilse Brenner who'd said little since the meeting began, studied the documentation Emilio laid across the table with an expression carrying a growing, visible alarm. "These prior settlements were confidential," she said slowly. "How did you gain access to this information?" "Through my management company's oversight of the building's harassment complaint history," Emilio said. "Information I have legitimate access to as the property owner. I'm not interested in the legal technicalities of how uncomfortable this makes your firm, Ms. Brenner. I'm interested in why 3 prior complaints against the same broker were settled quietly instead of addressed directly, and why a 4th incident, this one witnessed by someone with no financial stake in protecting Preston's client relationships, is only now forcing this conversation to happen at all." Preston's composure cracked visibly at that, the careful defensiveness giving way to something closer to open panic. "These are exaggerated misunderstandings that got blown out of proportion by people looking for a payout. I documented every incident myself," June said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began, her voice carrying a steadiness that surprised even her given the weight of directly confronting a man who'd threatened to end her career only days earlier. "Dates, times, exact language. The elevator comment wasn't a misunderstanding. The account reassignments that followed weren't coincidence. And the performance review initiated this week, timed exactly when I began preparing a formal complaint, speaks for itself." "You have no proof any of that was retaliatory," Preston said, though his voice carried increasingly less conviction with each word. "I have witness testimony," Emilio said, "from myself regarding the elevator incident directly. I have documentation of 3 prior complaints your firm chose to settle rather than address. And I have a performance review, dated and time-stamped, that any reasonable investigation will recognize as retaliation rather than legitimate performance management." He turned to address Ilse Brenner directly. "My foundation currently leases this entire floor to your firm, along with 2 others in this building. I'd like to make clear that my continued relationship with this firm depends entirely on how leadership chooses to handle what's in front of you today." The room held a silence carrying real, unmistakable weight. Preston's careful practiced deniability finally, visibly collapsing under scrutiny. He clearly hadn't prepared to face this directly, in front of leadership whose own institutional exposure now outweighed whatever revenue Preston's client relationships had once justified protecting. "What happens now?" Preston said finally, and for the first time since the meeting began, his voice carried something closer to genuine fear than calculated defense. "Now this firm decides whether to finally address 6 years of protected misconduct," Emilio said, "or whether to continue prioritizing one broker's client relationships over the well-being of every woman who's worked near him. I'd suggest considering carefully how that decision affects your lease going forward." Ilse Brenner exchanged a long, grim look with the other assembled leadership. The particular gravity of people recognizing exactly how serious the institutional exposure had become. "I think," she said slowly, "we need to terminate Mr. Cole's employment effective immediately, and reopen the 3 prior settlements at the affected employee's request, along with rescinding Ms. Okafor's performance review entirely." Preston's authority at the firm, built over 15 years of protected, unaddressed misconduct, ended in that room in that moment. The specific devastating finality of watching carefully maintained deniability collapse under evidence too thorough and too independently verified to argue past successfully. 6 months later, June stood near the same elevator bank where Emilio had first held the doors, though the space around her had changed considerably since that ordinary Tuesday morning that had reshaped the entire trajectory of her year. Her accounts had been fully restored within a week of Preston's termination, along with a formal apology from firm leadership and, more meaningfully to June, a promotion that finally, officially recognized 4 years of client relationships she'd built and maintained through methodical, careful work nobody had bothered crediting until an outside observer forced the firm to actually look. 2 of the 3 women from the prior settlements had reached out to her directly once their non-disclosure agreements were formally released, each conversation carrying its own complicated mixture of relief and grief for years spent silenced. June had spent several evenings simply listening to them, understanding in a way she hadn't fully grasped before, that her own willingness to document and confront had opened a door for considerably more people than just herself. Emilio found her near the elevators that afternoon, his presence no longer requiring the same careful, deliberate construction of reasons to be on her floor. Their partnership had built, over 6 months, into something neither of them had bothered naming formally, though both understood exactly what it had become. "You didn't need me to hold that door today," he said, watching her step into the elevator car alongside 2 colleagues without a flicker of the old, practiced tension she'd once carried into that same space. "I don't think I need you to hold every door anymore," June said, meeting his eyes with an ease that had built gradually since the confrontation with Preston months earlier. "I learned something watching you refuse to just ride past that morning. It's not that someone else has to fix it every time. It's that I stopped believing I had to just absorb it quietly the way I had for a year before you showed up. You'd already built the documentation before I ever offered to help," Emilio said. "I didn't teach you to notice the pattern. I simply made sure the room finally had to listen once you'd already done the work of proving it existed." Something in June's chest loosened at that, the particular unfamiliar warmth of having her own contribution named clearly rather than folded entirely into someone else's rescue narrative. "I spent a year telling myself that staying quiet was the safer choice," she said. "That making a fuss would cost me more than simply enduring it. I don't think that was ever actually true. I think quiet endurance just made it easier for everyone around me to look away." "It's not quiet anymore," Emilio said. "And I don't intend to let it go unnoticed again, whatever this becomes between us going forward, professionally or otherwise." June looked around the elevator bank at colleagues who now greeted her with genuine respect rather than the uncomfortable, complicit silence she'd once navigated daily, at a building that had once been the site of her worst professional humiliation now standing as proof of exactly how much could change when someone with real power simply refused to look away. She thought about the version of that Tuesday morning where Emilio had simply continued to the elevator he was originally headed toward, where Preston's cruelty had gone unchallenged the way it always had before, where 3 other women's silenced experiences might have remained buried indefinitely alongside her own. That version had been the only one she'd ever expected, right up until a stranger had decided deliberately that a closing door wasn't worth letting cruelty pass as normal one more time. "I don't think I'll ever fully forget standing in that elevator," June said quietly. "But I think I've finally stopped being afraid of what happens if I refuse to make myself small in it." If you watched someone else absorb cruelty in a room full of people who said nothing, would you have been the one to hold the door, or would you have simply ridden past, the way everyone else always had before Emilio? Thank you for reading. If June's story stayed with you, there are more waiting.